Morning all. Let's have a look at the very interesting encounter in the London Chess Classic between Judit Polgar playing white and Hikaru Nakamura playing black in round 5. So this was a very interesting opening in this game. After e4, e5, we see the Royal Lopez being adopted, being used by Judit. a6, bishop a4, knight f6. Now after castles, Nakamura played b5, bishop b3, and now this next move represents the modern archangelist variation, or modern archangel variation, bishop c5. For those of you interested just theoretically in the opening, there's an interesting bit of wiki which explains the old way of playing this was bishop b7, this is very interesting. It seems as though white might have something on f7 with knight g5, but black has d5, and after ed now black should play knight d4, and it's an active position. If black plays knight takes d5 instead, white will be better with queen h5, and you might wonder what that does. It provokes g6, which weakens the f6 square, a very important subtlety actually. So after g6 queen f3, there's a double attack now here, and this is really annoying, this position, this double attack, because also there's going to be a further double attack. If black takes here, bishop takes d5, and this is a big problem for this pin on c6, and black not having queen f6, which is why white's got a big advantage here. That's very horrible for black. So that's why queen h5 in this position is critical and refutes black's play, whilst queen f3 instead, black's okay actually with queen takes g5, and here has the resource queen f6. So just for those interested in technicalities of the old archangel system, but let's go back. After bishop b3, the modern way is the modern archangelist bishop c5, and actually we've seen recently a game by Natalia Pokonina in this system, using a great game with black. It's a very interesting system, bishop c5. And you might think it's encouraging white at some point for this tactical idea of knight takes e5 for d4, which would grab a centre pawn away from black. Well, let's see. First of all, a4 is played. Black defends with rook b8, and now Judit plays a takes b. After a takes b, does use this tactical positional idea of playing knight takes e5 here. And you might think there are various resources and tries for black here. We could go over them in the second pass of video, but for the moment in the game, knight takes e5, d4, and Nakamura, he takes on d4. Okay, queen takes d4, d6. I'll say at this point white's doing fine. White has a slight advantage, and active pieces here, for example, nothing blocked in, and we see the move f4, which looks good. Extend the scope of this rook as well, so both rooks are quite happy here, it seems, in this position. All pieces are quite happy. Knight c6, okay, the queen drops back to c3, gaining a tempo, attacking that knight. The knight goes to e7. Now we see knight d2, protecting that pawn. Black castles, and then obviously e5. For the moment, again, you know, white seems to be doing very nicely here. Knight fd5, and now Judit has a few interesting possibilities. Perhaps it would be interesting to play queen f3, for example, which we'll check in the second pass of this game. Here she decides to give up this bishop for that knight on d5. So why do this? Bishop takes d5. It is an interesting decision. After knight takes d5, queen d4 is played. And one thing is, but white will have this nice square for the knight, it seems. After bishop b7, there's a nice square now for the knight. And pressure on that d file potentially. One downside, though, at the moment, would appear that this bishop is slightly hemmed in by this pawn on f4. The queen is also a potential target to the move c5, which might be useful for black at some point. Black actually uses another interesting forcing move, though, in this position. Black plays f5. So he's really trying to fix down this pawn, which is hemming in this bishop. So maybe out of all the white pieces here, this bishop potentially is not as happy as before. We see knight g5. Okay, knight e6 being threatened, queen d7 parrying that, and not minding e6 here. On e6, just maybe queen e7 with h6 to follow. So Judit plays knight f3. Okay, and now rook a8 is played, contesting the a file. Bishop d2. And now we see the other forcing move available to black, c5, hitting the queen. Queen goes to d3 in this position. Does Naka want to potentially kick the queen again with, say, this, but potentially weakening some dark squares, but getting a little bit more space? He chooses this as overall maybe he thinks that's okay. Queen d4. And now we see d takes e5. Okay, now in this position it would seem that if white plays f takes, it would be nice to liberate the bishop, but maybe, just maybe, f4, and that's something to check out in the second pass. It would be extending the scope of this rook. Still, the bishop wouldn't be that great on that diagonal. So in this position actually, knight takes e5 was played. Queen c7. And there's a potential tactical vulnerability associated with queen c7, that this queen eyeing e5 maybe in the future, not too distant future, knight takes f4 could be a problem for white. But also the queen is getting out of the way for this knight to retreat back. That's another benefit of playing queen c7, and keeping control of these key dark squares as well. We see now rook fd1, and now the move h6, voluntarily weakening g6, which you might think is a little bit odd, but okay. Bishop e1, rook fe8, and now we see that really on the cards is rook takes, and knight takes f4. This knight all of a sudden feels a bit loose because of this f4. And actually, a little bit of indecisiveness. Bishop d2 is shown just to defend against this tactic, it seems. Rook ed8. What's the new tactic? Threat. Knight b4. This queen is a bit of a victim in the centre at the moment of threats. White takes on a8 here, which has a little bit of a downside after rook takes a8, that now Naka has the potential for rook a2, which could come in handy with c3s targeting c2 if this rook is allowed to show its presence on that 7th rank. Also, this bishop still not so happy with it blocked in by its own pawn. This bishop is happier, I'd say, than this bishop. We see the move h3 here. Now rook a2, as though the threat might be c3 now. So at the moment, black seems to have overall better pieces. The rook is slightly more active than this rook. Bishop is slightly happier than this bishop in terms of complementing the structure. Rook b1 seems like a little bit of a passive move. And we see now knight f6, and this e4 square is useful, for example, bishop e4, targeting c2. We see bishop b4 now, bishop e4 being played. So it starts to look a little bit miserable, this position here. How is white going to cope with these threats? Is she really going to play rook c1? Will that do in this position? Seems a bit passive. Queen's holding on to b2, so technically that might appear possible. What if black builds up pressure with, say, well, I think we'll leave it to the second pass, because I think the queen has to guard perhaps d8 here, so it's a bit of a tricky position to check out here. But in the game, what we see now is a very, very interesting dynamic move from white. Judit plays rook e1, just offering the c2 pawn. Intuitively, it seems a bit dangerous that if this pawn is taken, what about, for example, knight g6? And then isn't this check on e7 potentially dangerous? The pawn is taken here, and we don't actually see knight g6. That looks to be an interesting move in this position. What we see is a very, very aggressive move on the king side here. Judit plays g4. Okay. And with g4, well, if black takes, then maybe this bishop's a little bit in trouble. If it scurries back, then what about f5 or g5? A lot of opportunities would seem to be available to white. So very interesting pawn sack. Necker decides to go for a trade of queens, queen a7. Okay, can this exchange be avoided with, say, bishop c5? That's something we need to check out in the second pass of this game, if bishop c5 is possible. Okay, in the game, he decides to take the queen here, play this forcing move, knight c6. Rook goes to a6, and now another forcing move, check. After king f7. Okay, she plays the move g5 now, which seems very interesting indeed. Black takes on g5, fg, and now knight e4 is played. White is regaining the pawn, but g5 means she'll still be a pawn down. If she tries to protect with h4, okay, that is something else to check out. But in the game, knight takes f5, knight takes g5. But now rook e7 seems dangerous, king g6. Knight d4. Okay, so white still is a pawn down. It's opposite coloured bishops, but the pieces are quite active here. However, what about h3 as well? Isn't that a problem? The knight at the moment is attacking the bishop, so bishop reacts to that, bishop d3. But what about h3 here? And isn't there a big problem with rook a2? For example, king h2, rook a2, bishop c3. What about b4 there? Or is rook g7 dangerous? The knight's in the way at the moment. That possibility of rook g7 at least. But b4, it's pretty quick to take on b2 here. So maybe not. Maybe king h2 is ruled out in this position. We'll check this position out in the second pass, but if king h2 is ruled out, that might help explain Judit's next move, which is to play rook b7. Okay. There was also knight b5 to consider. Now knight takes h3. Technically, at the moment, at this very moment, black is 2 pawns up. Knight g5. Now after knight takes b5, okay, just 1 pawn up. So is it a big deal? It's opposite coloured bishops. But we see now that white's king safety is quite precarious after this next move, rook f6. All of a sudden, hold on a sec, what are all these pieces doing over here on the b file? Black's pieces seem to have naughty intentions here. Like f2 is dangerous, picking up b2 straight away. This next move would seem to react to that. Rook f2, defending f2. But now rook f4. Okay, what is going on with rook f4? Well, it becomes apparent now. After knight c3, the idea is revealed. Rook g4 creates a force field for the white king not to escape, and also threatening knight f3 check with a mating net consequence potentially. With bishop f1 to seal g2, then rook h4, for example, would be mating. Even though the bishop's covering g1, this rook h4 is also really dangerous in this position. So here it's become exceptionally dangerous for white's king safety. In fact, now after Judith's next move, knight d1, we see bishop f1 and this huge threat of knight f3 encourages Judith to resign here. It looks to be a forced mate from this mating net which has been created around the white king. Let's check this out now. So here Judith resigned. A very interesting dynamic battle between these two players. So in this final position, it is actually a forced mate in 4. For example, check. Okay, it doesn't really do much, the check. Let's throw it in. Let's imagine king h1 here, knight f3, with the threat of rook h4. So mating next move can only play a desperate move to stop rook h4. So this is a mating net. All of these squares are covered. If bishop e7, you might think then there's rook g1 mate. So white's king safety was really taken apart there. Let's have a look from the start of this game and flip the board. So Hikaru choosing the modern arcangulist variation. So bishop e4, now b5. So the old way of playing it is bishop b7, called just simply the arcangulist defense or arcangel defense, which was invented, by the way, in the city of Arcangulist. So we see bishop c5, the modern arcangel system. a4. Okay, for the moment white enjoys a slight advantage. Now either knight e5 apparently or ab. Technically the engine likes both moves. Okay. Knight takes e5. So this positional kind of tactic. In this position, by the way, you might think, is there anything else? Not really, surely. If bishop f2, this isn't very nice, because d4, and white enjoys a great centre here. A very pleasant position for white with that f-file. Why give white f-file dynamics? So after knight takes e5 here, not too many choices. Knight takes e5 is the best move. Now after d4, you might think again, well, what about knight g6 or bishop d6? On knight g6, d takes c. Again, white's doing well here because this looks like a very pleasant position. Even though it's double pawns, white's can have bishop e3, and it's going to be a nice position with the two bishops like that. So okay, so this continuation would seem black's best to just take here on d4. Queen takes d4, d6, but again, you know, white enjoys a small advantage from this position at the moment. Knight c6, queen c3, fairly logical. White still enjoying a nice position here. No pieces are unhappy for white at the moment. But after e5, knight f d5, I think here is where this was a happy bishop targeting f7 all the time. And perhaps, possibly, this is a better idea to maintain the bishop in retrospect with queen f3 or queen d3. If queen f3, even though it looks a little bit silly for bishop b7 maybe initially, that's not a big deal. Say knight e4, rook a8. White has an advantage still, it seems, in this position. These pieces look okay. You know, these two in particular seem to be enjoying the position, and there's no, you know, problem really. You can't consider that bishop a problem. In the game, what we saw was this pawn being locked as well. Here, there's potential for f5 in the future, but f5 would be more unthinkable with a bishop on b3 here. So if we contrast that to the game continuation, it seems by giving up the light square bishop, black is also more enabled for f5 later, which would block in and make unhappy this bishop on c1. So we see bishop takes d5, and this bishop on c1 is feeling a bit of pain now after f5. Does black really want to take en passant? Not really, I think. If we examine en passant, black's doing fine, maybe even slightly better now. This bishop's really enjoying that diagonal, for example. Okay, so f5, black seems to be doing okay now in this position, at least equal. Okay, knight f3. I think there's really a problem piece here on c1. Rook a8, and that a file now being contested. c5, c4. Okay, now d takes e5. Now let's examine this f takes e5 as an alternative. I thought intuitively f4 was an interesting move, but maybe it's not that hot. F takes, as bishop takes f4 here, that's loose, that f4 pawn. So it takes. It's not that hot. I don't think this is particularly good for black to have that pawn on f4, but perhaps something else. Rook fd8. Okay, it's an interesting alternative anyway to play f takes e5. It's a valid alternative to knight takes e5. In fact, maybe even. Okay, there's nothing really in it technically, but it seems intuitively that it will be trying to liberate the bishop with f takes e5 a little bit more. The pawn's a little bit weaker. Knight on e5 is an aggressive piece though to balance things. So knight takes e5 is an aggressive knight, but itself is a tactical target potentially to knight takes f4 if white's not careful. And here we see that after bishop e1, indeed, now knight takes f4 is actually threatened, so the bishop actually goes back a little bit indecisively. Okay, now the queen's a bit of a target here. Now this is a slight concession. What we've seen with rook takes a8 is maybe a principle to take is a slight mistake, but what else can white do here? The queen is being slightly harassed. Let's say the queen goes to f2. c3 appears to be a good resource. Knight takes c3. This looks like an unpleasant position, in fact, for white, with knight e4 as a prospect coming up. So okay, so in the game we see rook takes a8, which has a little bit of a downside. That rook a2 is a nasty invasion point. h3, rook a2, and now there is a threat, I believe, of either c3 or queen b6. c3 is pretty annoying here. Rook b1, knight f6. Black is enjoying a small advantage in this position. Even though the bishop seems to have now this diagonal, it's not so bad. But black's bishop is more central, and with a clear c2 target. So we see the pawn sack. What else? If rook c1, it seems miserable. In fact here, okay, let's go with knight d5, double attack. Knight takes f4, threatening to win the queen. Can we go with king h2? Well, it gets worse actually, there's the fork anyway for the rook. So that's very unpleasant, what white is having to face here. So with this move, rook e1, maybe that is against, for example, knight d5. What would happen here? We have rook takes e4, in fact, in this position, and then white would be okay here. So that seems to be designed against knight d5 in particular, as well as being a pawn sack. The pawn sack aspect is accepted. Okay, and now we see the move g4. Quite a radical move here, g4. What else? Knight g6 would seem tempting for this e7 square. Let's go with queen d7, queen e5, bishop e4 blocking that e file, king h2. Black doesn't seem to have too many problems here in this position. Okay, so in the game we see g4, very aggressive try, queen a7, and now what of bishop c5? Because it would appear slightly dangerous that white has, for example, queen d8 on the cards. That can be parried with queen a5, in fact attacking the rook and defending d8. So let's say rook f1. Let's go with this computer move, queen a8. What's happening here? As an example. Okay, this kind of scenario is not nice. If the centre is challenged, white's losing a bit of central control here. Okay, and it looks as though black's 2-1 should tell soon. 2-1 pawn majority. So okay, queen a7, we see the queen's coming off. Knight c6, check. And you might think taking on f5, that is interesting. Knight takes f5 instead of g5. Let's have a quick look at that. Bishop takes, check. This isn't so dangerous. In fact, the king's got a bit of a menace here. If we stop the king from being a menace, say we just take our piece back. Knight d5 is a pain still, protecting e7, double attack here. Okay, black's doing very well. So in the game we saw g5 in this position, we saw g5. And actually black's advantage is less than half a pawn technically at this depth. So still a fight here. Was HG actually... Okay, what is happening here after HG? Knight e4. Knight takes f5. Knight takes g5. Okay, but hold on a sec. Look at this. This isn't such a big deal. This is less than half a pawn advantage on depth 18 now. So let's have a look. Knight d6 check wasn't played. Instead, rook e7. Was that a little bit of an inaccuracy to play rook e7? The king is getting activated quite aggressively. On knight d6, what would be the benefit? Let's say king g6. Rook e3, protecting h3. This seems okay. Doesn't seem as bad as the game, in any case. An interesting position. And white could even have some attacking prospects, for example, like this. What we were back in the game with the opposite colour bishop being quite dangerous here. White's ball back in the game completely. That's very interesting. So I don't know. Knight d6. This is approaching move 40, first time control. Maybe this was a slight slip up. With rook e7, king's getting activated, and now this rook could have been useful with rook e3, but okay, bishop d3. Is something like rook e3 at all possible here? Just to defend h3. Apparently rook a1 check is very strong. Or rook a2. And this is a big problem. I think this continual idea of b4 here is strong. So this is a real problem. Okay, so it's not as good here as rook e3 as in the other variation. So we see rook b7 and knight takes h3, knight g5. White regaining the pawn, and it would seem if white can get that dark square bishop working, then okay, maybe black's not doing that well, but we see a big shift in now with rook f6. It becomes apparent that white's king is in trouble, and if we actually show this on an increasing depth, the king's safety implications I think start to be revealed, that white is in a little bit of trouble here. Or is it? Knight d6 appears to be one of the best moves. In the game we saw bishop c5, which, whoa, might be a clear blunder here. So why is knight d6 so good compared to bishop c5? Let's check this out. In the game we saw bishop c5, rook f4. Now let's imagine knight d6 was played. Why isn't rook f4 possible? Bishop c3 on g7. Now the shielding with knight f7, white can take on f7 here. If we look at the game continuation, it seems bishop c5 didn't help white at all to play bishop c5 in this position. So why not? Okay, we see rook f4, and I guess there's no bishop d4 here. I think c3 refutes. Let's have a look at bishop d4 in this position. Or is there something even stronger? In this position, black has time actually for rook g4. Weaving and mating that around the king here. If takes king h5. Okay, let's see what's going on here with knight d6. Why is knight d6 a big save here then? If we imagine rook f4 in this position and try and echo what we've just seen there, bishop c3, rook g4, why is this bad here? Rook takes G7, King H5. Here it's revealed this knight is much more dangerous on D6. It can play knight E8 just in time for knight F6 check. And it becomes apparent, maybe Judit has missed a great way to salvage the game. This move bishop C5 put her king safety, it seems, on the brink of collapse. Just playing a move. It's cruel how chess is cruel, but this move knight D6 here would seem to be the absolute best move to play at this depth anyway. And bishop C5, white's king safety is destroyed here after bishop C5. We have this very, very dangerous maneuver now coming in. So rook F4. And we see knight C3, which probably again doesn't help. Knight C3, and that's starting to be over. It's absolutely over after knight C3. Let's have a look at rook B8 as well. What is going on here with rook B8? If rook G4 here, okay, bishop E3, check. It seems very, very scary for white's king. But okay, it's not immediately mating this position anyway. In the game, we see after knight C3 that rook G4 is becoming a very bad mating net, and it's actually a mate in 4 now, just going straight into a mate in 4 after bishop F1. Very, very interesting dynamic game here. The modern archangelist system seems to be a very interesting system for black. Hope you got something out of it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.